Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. So this is the 12th and final, for now, episode in my series about the history and hauntings of Fordham University. And the last two episodes, I've been talking about different theories behind why a place could be haunted and what could cause hauntings in general. And I'm going to continue with that in this episode. So I'm going to look at some general ideas behind hauntings, but I'm also going to look a bit deeper into some of Fordham University's history and things that have happened and kind of my theory behind why Fordham might be haunted. You know, if I had to choose one theory, which luckily no one's making me choose just one theory. I think there's a lot of different things that could be at play here. But if I had to choose just one theory, I do have one, and that's what I'll get to at the end of this episode. But before I get into the main bit of the episode, since I'm talking about weird paranormal phenomena in the Bronx, I wanted to pause and talk real quick about a cool witchy place that just opened up in the Bronx a few months ago. So yesterday, I went up to the Bronx to visit a new space called Bronx Witch Headquarters, which is in the South Bronx on Grand Concourse, a couple blocks away from Yankee Stadium. For folks who aren't very familiar with the Bronx, that's only a couple subway stops away from Manhattan, depending on which train you're on, so it's a very easy place to get to. And Bronx Witch Headquarters is kind of like WeWork, but for witches. It's a work share space that folks who do readings, healing, and that sort of thing can work out of. And you can also rent the space for classes and stuff. You might follow the owner, Allie, on Instagram. Her handle is Bronx Witch, and she's definitely worth a follow if you don't follow her because she posts a lot of great stuff. And I know that she has some cool events planned out of Bronx Witch Headquarters. So, for example, she's doing a tea and tarot event this weekend on Sunday, March 20th for the spring equinox. You can follow the Bronx Witch Headquarters Instagram at Bronx Witch HQ, or you can visit the website at bronxwitch.com to stay in the loop and hear about any other events. And the reason why I'm talking about this is I think that what Allie is doing is really cool, and I'm especially excited to see a place like this open up in the Bronx. If you live outside of New York City, you might not be super familiar with the scene here, but there are some really cool shops that cater towards witchy type people and have classes and events and stuff, but they're mostly located in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and I, at least, can find them a little bit intimidating. But Allie is so nice, and she's really focused on building community and just establishing a welcoming environment. So if you live in New York City and you're some sort of witchy person who needs a space to see clients or teach classes, or maybe if you're just interested in going to a witchy event, then definitely check out Bronx Witch Headquarters. And if you want to know more about it in general, you should check out the podcast Chaos and Shadow. Allie was a guest on a recent episode, and that was a really great conversation to listen to. So definitely worth a listen if you're interested in learning more. Also, side note, because I can never resist a side note, if you're a fan of New York City history and you haven't been to the neighborhood around Yankee Stadium, you definitely should. I mentioned that Bronx Witch Headquarters is on Grand Concourse, which is a really famous street in the Bronx. It was envisioned in the 1890s and it opened in the 1900s, I think like 1909 or something. And it's modeled on the Champs-Élysées, like in Paris. It also looks a lot like Park Avenue in Manhattan. It's this grand avenue where all of these beautiful apartment buildings were built in the early 20th century. There was even a fancy movie palace, the Lowe's Paradise Theater, which opened near Fordham in 1929. Which is on Grand Concourse, and it's still around today. It isn't a movie theater anymore, but it was used as an event space for a while, and now it's used by a church. But anyway, if you go to that part of the Bronx near Yankee Stadium, you should definitely check out the Grand Concourse Historic District. It's beautiful around there, and there's also the Bronx Museum of the Arts, which is a really cool and free art museum. I went there yesterday when I was in the neighborhood, and they were having their biennial, and there were just so many really cool pieces to see. I feel like a lot of people in New York City don't go to the Bronx very often, if you live outside of the Bronx. But the Bronx is great. It's extremely worth a trip if you're in the area. And, if you don't make it up there very often, there is a lot to see and a lot to do there. And again, give Bronx Witch headquarters a follow at Bronx Witch HQ on Instagram, or visit the website at bronxwitch.com, and I'll include that info in my show notes as well. All right, so let's get into this episode about theories about why Fordham might be so haunted. Real quick, I did want to mention something that I touched on in some of the previous episodes, especially some of the episodes earlier on in the series, which is the idea of poltergeist activity and potentially strong emotions being a sort of focus point for that poltergeist activity. So because I've talked about this already in this series, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but just real quick, the traditional poltergeist haunting is stereotypically centered around a young person going through puberty, often, but not always, a young girl. And the theory goes that that is a difficult, emotional, liminal time in a person's life, and if a poltergeist might be subsisting or feeding off of someone's energy, especially negative energy, then there is likely going to be a lot of that when someone is going through puberty, because that can be a difficult time in life, right? So while teenagers get the award for being the most angsty, it seems, at least as far as commonly accepted wisdom goes, I don't really think that college students are less angsty. And also, for most residential college students, they are still technically teenagers those first couple of years of college. But for a lot of people, there's a lot of heavy emotional stuff that they might be dealing with. And even under the best of circumstances, you're living in a new place with a lot of different people, away from family, possibly for the first time, for an extended amount of time, which could be emotional or stressful. So there were a number of hauntings that I talked about earlier in the series that had kind of poltergeist vibes, and to me, that just makes sense. So I personally think that's something that is at work in some of these Fordham hauntings. So now, again, I want to touch on something that I talked about more in some of the earlier episodes of this series. So I don't want to belabor the point here, but I did want to touch really quickly on the idea of intelligent hauntings versus residual hauntings, and stone tape theory and place memory, in part because while I was working on the series, I read a book called Hauntology: Ghosts of Futures Past by Merlin Coverley, which had some interesting ideas that I wanted to share. But before I do that, just a refresher. So intelligent hauntings are ghosts that can perhaps interact with observers or investigators, and residual hauntings are more like an echo or a moment in time that's played over and over, almost like a recording. So it can't interact with observers, etc. And you'll often hear stone tape theory invoked when talking about residual hauntings. So stone tape theory was popularized by a 1972 British TV play called The Stone Tape, which drew on the theory of residual hauntings by parapsychologist T.C. Lethbridge. So looking at the Fordham hauntings, there are definitely stories that fall into the intelligent haunting category. For example, the ghost exorcist at Queen's Court, which was a priest who handled a possibly demonic or some kind of entity and, handled it for an RA in the building, and they had a whole conversation, etc. And there are a bunch of stories of people having conversations and interacting with ghosts, in particular ghost priests. And then there's also stories that feel like they could be residual. Like I had told a story, again in one of the Queen's Court episodes, about, this phantom groundskeeper kind of still making his rounds. So if you were to ask me, I feel like there are both intelligent and residual hauntings happening at Fordham. But there's a bit in Merlin Coverley's book that mentioned place memory and spiritual conductors that really caught my eye when I was reading it. And, this is tied to stone tape theory, etc. And I think these ideas might have some connection to the experiences that I had of hearing strange sounds. So in the episode, The Demon in the Basement, I talked about these sounds that I heard consistently that didn't quite make sense in context, etc. And you can check out that episode if you want to know the full story. But I was hearing the sound of a bell ringing and also this gibbering sound. And that was while I was living in Finley Hall, the former medical building at Fordham University, which is where I lived my sophomore year. So I wanted to read this section from the book because it felt to me like it maybe shed some light on that. In his Ninth Bridgewater Treatise, 1837, the polymath and pioneering computing engineer Charles Babbage outlined the possibility that spoken words may leave permanent impressions in the air, oral residues, which only later become inaudible. The air itself, he wrote, is one vast library on whose pages are forever written all that man has ever said or woman whispered, speculating that at some point in the future, man might be able to rewind time and retrieve these lost voices from the past. Later, Edmund Gurney and Eleanor Sidgwick, both members of the Society for Psychical Research, introduced the concept of place memory as an explanation for haunting, proposing that certain locations could act as a type of spiritual conductor, preserving traces of past events which could subsequently be accessed by certain psychically attuned individuals. Haunting was coming to be seen less as a ghostly manifestation than as an example of mental projection, in which the subject was able to transmit an audible or visual trace through time and space. In 1939, the Welsh philosopher and then president of the SPR, H. Price, proposed that such memory traces were recorded via the medium of a universal psychic ether, an intermediary between spiritual and physical reality composed of images and ideas. But the figure who was perhaps the first to suggest that ghosts might not only be projections but recordings was the British physicist Sir Oliver Lodge, who, like so many of his contemporaries, appears to have conducted his scientific career in tandem with his paranormal interests. He wrote in Man and the Universe, 1908, "Take, for example, a haunted house, wherein some room is the scene of a ghostly representation of some long-past tragedy. On a psychometric hypothesis, the original tragedy has been literally photographed on its material surroundings, nay, even on the ether itself, by reason of the intensity of emotion felt by those who enacted it, and thenceforth, in certain persons, a hallucinatory effect is experienced corresponding to such an impression. It is this theory that is made to account for the feeling one has on entering certain rooms, that there is an alien presence therein, though it is invisible and inaudible to mortal sense." So anyway, I know that was a long passage to read, but it was interesting enough and it felt relevant enough that I wanted to make sure to read it all. To me, the Charles Babbage part about this idea of the air having this record of the past and, this idea of spoken words leaving a impression on the air fits really nicely into some of the theories that I had behind what the sounds I was hearing in Finley Hall were. And so I was really excited to find this passage because it felt like a little bit of confirmation isn't the right word, but I was like, okay, here's a framework that someone else was thinking about in terms of audible things being recorded and a place remembering things. Okay, so now I want to touch real quick on the ideas of tulpas and egregores and also on Fordham's history and connections to exorcism. I talked some earlier in this series about the links between Fordham and both the film The Exorcist, which was partially filmed on campus, but also exorcisms themselves. There are tons of creepy urban legends associated with the rite of exorcism on campus, like the ghost priest handling the entity haunting a building, etc. Or with the filming of the movie, which I talk about in the episode about Hughes Hall, which I called like the Exorcist dorm or something. And there were even hauntings in the old library building, Duane Library, which supposedly occurred in the area of the stacks where books on exorcism were kept. And also in some earlier episodes, I talked about some of the more speculative connections that Fordham may or may not have to exorcism, things that I have heard from people, but which I'm sure the university would deny. So I go into a lot more detail about that I don't remember which episode it is, but it's earlier on in the series. So one thing that I thought was interesting when thinking about Fordham's history is, like at, I assume, any residential university, plenty of people have died on campus, but I think it's safe to say that on-campus deaths haven't generally seemed to have entered the zeitgeist much when it comes to hauntings. But exorcism and the institution's connection to exorcism has. And I don't know how much of that is because, like I said, of the university's connections to exorcism and the film The Exorcist and the book The Exorcist. Are these connections creating hauntings on campus? Or, did they lead to hauntings on campus? Or just, is it just that the history of the place is so tied up in exorcism that, of course, there's going to be some references to exorcism in the urban legends on campus and in the paranormal events on campus? Or are people reading into the university's connections to exorcism and imagining things, or maybe even creating things by imagining them? If you go to a university and you're told, hey, this place is really haunted, also there's these connections to the exorcist and exorcism, if enough people are thinking that in a place, can that create phenomena? And to me, I think it's maybe a little bit of both. So that made me think of the idea of, like tulpas, egregores, thought forms. So I just wanted to touch on those ideas really briefly. To put it simply, a tulpa is an entity or a thing that is created through someone's spiritual or mental powers. Typically, this entity would be sentient and have its own thoughts. And, it's a thing that a person created from their mind, but that becomes real, right? And an egregore is, to read the Wikipedia definition, since I'm trying to be brief here, an occult concept representing a distinct, non-physical entity that arises from a collective group of people. So I'm not doing these topics justice here, but basically what I'm trying to say is, it seems to me that it could be possible that by thinking about hauntings and strange entities at Fordham, students could be creating these hauntings and these entities, either individually or as a group. And, a couple episodes ago, I talked about urban legends and that sort of thing, but one question I have here is, can you make an urban legend come to life? If enough people are believing this thing is real and replicating this idea and focusing on it, can it become real? To me, it seems possible, though to be super clear, I'm not well read on these topics, so I can't offer much more than just that question and my vague thought that it seems like something could be up here, but I'm by no means an expert on this topic at all. Okay, so let's really get into the meat of this episode. We're talking about the reasons why a place could be haunted, and of course, one of the most basic ideas that people always come to and default to, including myself, is, oh, well, something bad happened there, right? There's something in the history that screwed something up. Maybe recorded something bad in the stone tape, I don't know, screwed up the vibe, created this atmosphere for entities to be hanging around, creating this negativity that something could be feeding off of, etc. What could have left some sort of bad impression or uneasiness in a place? And for Fordham, the list is very, very long. And maybe this is true for any location, and this is just the location I happened to research. I'm sure that a lot of bad things probably happened there in that location prior to the university's founding. But just in the interest of time, I always feel so silly saying that, right? Because this is the 12th episode in this series, but I actually have cut myself off from time to time. Anyway, in the interest of time, I just want to confine myself to details that relate to the university's history, starting when it was founded and later. Let's start with the founding, right? Fordham is a Catholic school. It wasn't originally founded by the Jesuits, but pretty quickly it was taken on by the Jesuits. So I've actually talked in some detail about some of the French Jesuits in New York City prior to the founding of Fordham, like a long time ago, like the first Jesuits in New York City. And I covered that in one of the episodes about Calvary Cemetery, the one that is about Dagger John, aka Archbishop John Hughes, who is the guy who founded Fordham before handing it over to the Jesuits. And in that episode, I discussed what I'd say you can call the evil wizards of New York, or the Jesuits who came to New York State in the 1600s, and they tried to convert indigenous people, and they brought disease and discord and violence in their wake. And the indigenous peoples in this area generally did not trust them, and they called them black robes, which is a suitably sinister name, since, like evil wizards, the Jesuits brought both a system of magic, Catholicism, and the invisible spirits of death in the form of infectious diseases. They brought both of those things with them. So I have a little bit of a tendency to refer to them as evil wizards because that really seems like what their interaction was with people. And a number of the French Jesuits ended up being killed after a much larger number of indigenous people had died, to be clear. And those Jesuits who died have since been sainted and are considered martyrs. Again, if you want more of the history, check out that episode. Now, it was a different set of French Jesuits, a group from Kentucky, who bought Fordham from John Hughes in the 19th century. But they were French Jesuits nonetheless, and Fordham does have a connection with this group. And on campus, as I've mentioned in prior episodes, there is a dorm called Martyrs Court, which was built in 1951, and which, when I was there at least, was considered the least desirable dorm, or maybe the second least desirable dorm, for a number of very good reasons. It was also considered pretty haunted, and it was named after the French Jesuit martyrs. The building has 3 wings, each one named after one of the martyred French Jesuits, which I always thought was really screwed up. I can't remember if I mentioned this in a past episode, but there's also a big mural in Duane Library of one of the Jesuits, I believe. So, there's a lot kind of like honoring these martyrs. And I know they're like martyrs in the Catholic tradition, and Fordham's a Catholic school. I'm not so naive to think like Fordham is thinking critically about the history of these pretty, I would say, evil people. But, if we're talking about bad vibes, I think this is one. I think this could create some bad vibes, right? So let's just put a pin in the French Jesuits. I'll return to this later. Real quick, let's kind of fast forward to the present day. I will say, bad stuff goes on at every college campus. Fordham has no monopoly there. And I would even argue that because Fordham doesn't have Greek life, there are probably fewer bad incidents that happen on campus than might happen in a lot of other schools with more of a reputation for partying. I'm not going to say that people don't party at Fordham, and of course screwed up stuff does happen there. There's a reason why I decided to stop drinking during my senior year of college and have not drank since, but my impression is that most colleges, especially larger state colleges, have a worse record of really screwed up stuff happening on campus. Read Missoula by John Krakauer if you don't get what I'm alluding to. But anyway, let's look at some on-campus events that may or may not contribute to some of the anomalous stuff that people have reported at Fordham. I dug into some on-campus deaths, though I only wanted to look at ones from the 1980s and earlier. And I want to look at a few of the ways that Fordham is stuck in the past. And also, let's take a look at some of the sampling of incidents of racism and homophobia that have occurred on campus. Just because I talked about this in my episode, The Demon in the Basement, but I do think that an atmosphere of bigotry can definitely contribute to people's experiences of the paranormal, I think. It contributes to an uneasy feeling and causes a lot of mental suffering, let's call it, right? Like mental anguish, which a lot of people think has links potentially to the paranormal. So anyway, real quick, let's look at some of these deaths. So there have, of course, been deaths on Fordham's campus. I'm sure that's true of almost any university. But what I found interesting about deaths on Fordham's campus is that there's only 2 deaths that I can think of that are actually tied to stories of hauntings. There was the story of a seminarian in the 19th century who died of bad living conditions in St. John's Hall and whose ghost supposedly still haunts that place. And there is a story of a haunting relating to a construction worker who died while working on a dorm. So I was going to go through verbally a bunch of the deaths that have happened on campus, but I'm actually just going to include that in the show notes. If you want to see the rundown, check that out at buriedsecretspodcast.com. But kind of the thing I was looking at was when I was looking at some of the deaths that happened on campus, I was really just trying to see, is there anything that it feels like inspired a ghost story? And my answer to that is kind of just like, no, not really. I talked in length in another episode about how I don't think it's good form to graft stories of hauntings onto recent deaths. So to be clear, I wasn't trying to do that, but I was trying to answer the question of like, okay, what is influencing these stories of hauntings, right? Like, is it tied to events that people might have read about or remembered, from their years of school or from, the school's recent history? And it kind of seems like no. So I think that's notable because there's this idea that hauntings happen because of deaths, in particular because of the deaths of young people or people with unfinished business. And at least in Fordham's case, that just hasn't been a thing. There have mostly just been stories of Jesuits who have died and their ghosts have come back, supposedly. But, these are mostly like older men without families. Of course, any death is a tragedy, but it's kind of different from the idea of like, oh, this young college kid, died in their prime or whatever, and now they haunt this place, etc. So it's just interesting to me that the stories of hauntings tend to all be about like older people, either past Jesuits who've died or, in the one case, a construction worker who died. So anyway, moving on. I mentioned that if you forced me to choose one cause or reason for Fordham's hauntings, I think I would have to say that, at least when I was a student there, Fordham felt like a place stuck in the past. It was a place where time kind of folded in on itself. So, of course, there were ghosts and strange things happening, right? Like, it felt like you stepped onto campus and you were kind of just in this other world. And at least for me, as someone who's interested in history, I think that some of Fordham's vibe of really looking back into history and kind of being old-fashioned attracted me to Fordham, at least aesthetically. I feel embarrassed mentioning internet aesthetics 2 episodes in a row, but last episode I talked about the liminal space aesthetic, but nowadays there's this very popular internet aesthetic called dark academia, which sort of evokes this late 19th to mid 20th century prep school / Ivy League kind of vibe, collegiate Gothic, etc. And it's very popular among, I was going to say among young people, but that makes me sound like I'm 1,000 years old. But it's very popular among Gen Z, And I totally understand the appeal of this dark academia aesthetic. And actually, I'm just going to read you a little bit from the aesthetics wiki page for dark academia, because I don't know how well I'm describing this, but to me, it really describes what attracted me to Fordham. Like, I was attracted to the ghost stories. I was attracted to the fact that I had a scholarship. That was probably the most important thing that attracted me to Fordham. I was attracted to the fact that it was in New York City, but there was also this other thing that at the time I didn't really have the vocabulary for, but now I understand that I was attracted to the kind of dark academia vibes that the university has. So here's kind of a definition for dark academia. Dark academia is a popular aesthetic that revolves around classic literature, the pursuit of self-discovery, and a general passion for knowledge and learning. Dark academia's visuals stem primarily from upper-class European cultures of the 19th century, Gothicism, and American prep. The upper class of this time period emphasized a liberal education in which Latin, rhetoric, and classics were taught subjects. These are now seen as unusual and slightly esoteric, creating an allure that presents schooling as not dreary or boring, but one that cultivates mystery, curiosity, and diligence that isn't commonly seen in contemporary schooling. So I'm going to include 2 links in the show notes about this. I'll include the wiki page for this, and I'll also include the link to a YouTube video that I think is really good called The Problem with Dark Academia. You can just search that in YouTube and find it too, just because there are a lot of issues with glamorizing this sort of tradition, like this tradition of a certain kind of like Western elite education for the wealthy. And to be honest, I'm about to get into some of those problems, but I'm not really gonna do like a whole takedown of it. But I think this YouTube video really intelligently explains some of the issues with glamorizing this sort of thing. That being said, I still am attracted to this like dark academia aesthetic. Like I like to look at pictures online of cozy libraries and collegiate Gothic buildings and that sort of thing. And you can certainly still enjoy something while seeing issues with it. But when I was a teenager and kind of glamorizing this aesthetic aspect of Fordham, and it wasn't just the aesthetics, right? Like it was also the academics. Like I thought that I wanted a more classical liberal arts education. It turns out I didn't. I know now I did not. But when you're a teenager, you don't really know what you want to study anyway, right? And I'm from suburban Texas, a place where there aren't that many structures around that predate, honestly, the 1980s. And I just loved the idea of being wrapped up in this place that felt so old, these old buildings, these old ghosts, like the place felt haunted, and I really liked that. But there is a bad side to that, right? Because obviously there's a lot of bad stuff in history, and while there's still a lot of terrible stuff going on today, I think many people would say that things have improved for most people, right? So if you're attracted to something because it makes you think of the past, that may not be a good thing. Just so you know, this section of the episode was originally much longer. I cut out more than 1,000 words worth of content about how this school, at least at the time that I was there, felt a lot like the reject modernity, embrace tradition meme, but not ironic. They literally handed out a syllabus from the 1950s at the orientation for my program, for example. And they were bragging about how similar the syllabus was these days now being more than a decade ago, but how similar the then current syllabus was to the syllabus in the 1950s. And I, again, was too naive to see that that was a major issue and a huge red flag. I understand that apparently the program I was in has changed significantly since then, but at least at the time that I was there, that was the vibe on campus. I'm from the Bible Belt, and I thought I knew what stifling conservatism felt like, but my experiences in school proved me very wrong. Though, in the interest of fairness, side note, in February, I think it was last month, Fordham did announce a new university president. And when I saw who it was, I just about fell out of my chair because the person that they chose was not a priest, shocking, but even more surprisingly, the new president is a woman, which is the first in the university's history. And I don't know much about this woman, but just the fact that they chose someone who is not a priest and who was not a man, I honestly never thought I would see the day, right? I was very, very surprised at this sort of like sop to modernity that the university decided to go with. And I think it's a good thing, to be clear. I think it's great that they have a female president and a president who's not a priest. But boy, was I surprised. So let's talk a little bit about some of the feelings of isolation and paranoia on campus. Because that, to me, is really tied into my experiences of hauntings there, and also just this feeling that it is a place, it's like an island in time. It's like a blast from the past. It's like, feels like this weird other world and like not in a good way. In the episode, The Demon in the Basement, I talked about how I believe that my own personal feelings of isolation and paranoia, caused mostly by interpersonal issues and my own illness, but not just that, contributed to some of the paranormal experiences I had on Fordham's campus. However, the school itself has a sense of isolation from and paranoia about the wider community, something that I find completely unacceptable. And as naive as I was when I was a student, I had a problem with this then too. It's bad. The campus is gated and has guards posted at the gates, and there's this strong sense of it being totally separate from the neighborhood. And, reminder, it's in the Bronx. And I could go on for a long time about my own experiences and my thoughts about it, but I know that if I do that, I won't find a way to be even remotely brief because I have just too much to say about the subject. So again, in the interest of time, I wanted to read a bit from a 2015 article that I found on the website Welcome to the Bronx, since it had a great quote from a student who was from the neighborhood. So someone who can give a perspective that's different from my own. And before I read this bit, the article mentions Belmont, which is the neighborhood just south of campus, and Arthur Avenue, which is a major street with restaurants and bars that students frequent. It's called the Little Italy of the Bronx. So when the article mentions Arthur Ave, that's what it's talking about. So, to read from this article, third-generation Bronxite Antoinette Lanini, a Fordham student who lives in Belmont in the shadows of the university, has these heartfelt words to say, which have resonated with many other students online. I have never felt like more of a stranger in my own home on Arthur Ave than when I started going to Fordham. The disconnect between students on campus with people who have been living in this community for years is so great that the local Bronx residents are referred to as the now derogatory term locals, who are assumed to be predominantly Black or Latino. But even with my discomfort on campus, I'm still a white student and have never felt personally discriminated against because I'm not assumed to be from the Bronx. This discomfort comes from hearing/seeing the thoughts and actions of other students in the Bronx and of locals. I've never been called a local or assumed to be from the Bronx, even though my family has been living on Arthur Avenue for 3 generations. I've never been stopped at the gate when I don't have my ID. Not once have I ever been questioned as to whether or not I went to Fordham. When I hear the word local out of some people's mouths, I hear such negativity. It almost sounds like people are referring to an annoyance, an obstacle in their college fun that they have to deal with. Now, there's nothing wrong with calling someone a local, but the tone and assumptions that can be adhered to this name by Fordham students is what becomes so problematic. This culture of classism, racism, and sexism on campus is stultifying to our growth communally as well as individually, and the safety of our students is at risk. I really recommend that you read the whole article. This student had a lot of smart stuff to say. But yeah, the vibe on campus feels that you're not just an island in time, like separate from the modern world, again, in a bad way, but it also feels really cut off from the community, of course, but also like stale and stagnant. Like it feels like there's something wrong. And I mean that in sort of a more metaphysical way, right? So I actually visited Fordham's campus a couple weeks ago. It was the first time I had visited campus in 7 years, and I definitely felt uneasy the moment I stepped onto campus. I had made a day of being in the Bronx, so I walked around near Lehman College's campus, and then I went to Van Cortlandt Park, which I'll probably do an episode about someday. It's a really cool park in the Bronx. And I did a bit of hiking there, and then I walked down to Fordham's campus. Now, some of this feeling could be my own bias and my own memories of my time at Fordham. You know, maybe if you're someone with no baggage related to Fordham and you step onto campus, you would feel fine. Maybe, depending on who you are. But I don't know. I stepped onto campus and my feeling of having a nice, relaxing day evaporated as soon as I got there. So first, to get onto campus, you have to show an ID. And I had my alumni ID card, which they give out to alumni basically so you can show it to get back onto campus. Because it really is a closed campus. However, even with my alumni ID, they almost didn't even let me step onto campus. The guard actually had to call his boss and then get permission. And then even after that, he was like, okay, like he said, you can't go into any buildings, but you're allowed to walk around on campus. So then the whole time I was walking around campus, I think because from the start, I sort of felt like I shouldn't be there, you know, like I wasn't allowed to be there. I just had this feeling like I was being watched. And I had forgotten that even though the campus is closed and they don't really let visitors onto campus, there are security cars constantly driving around campus. And, you know, in retrospect, when I really think about it, I'm like, yeah, I guess I do remember that. But I'm not used to that anymore. And that really put me on edge. You know, there aren't really cars on campus. Like there are some roads, but there aren't really cars driving around except for the security vehicles. And they were really everywhere all the time. And I had forgotten that. Also, like I mentioned, I had been walking around near Lehman College's campus earlier, and the vibe there had been really different. You know, I was walking around, I saw groups of students hanging out, and multiple times I noticed students looking over at me as if they thought they might know me. You know, the vibe was just really friendly, and it felt to me as if at any time someone might walk over and say hello to me, if that makes sense, right? And at Fordham, on the other hand, the atmosphere was very cold and pretty unfriendly. And as I was walking around, I remembered that feeling from back when I was a student, but I think I just assumed that I had that feeling because I was unhappy back then. And again, of course, my recent memory, my recent experience could have just been tainted by my own memories. But either way, the vibe there was bad. You know, I didn't feel like anyone was gonna like be friendly and say hello. It's not like anyone was being mean or anything. It was just the absence of friendliness, if that makes sense. And, you know, there are a lot of differences between Fordham and Lehman College, of course, even though the two schools are only about a mile away from each other. But importantly, Lehman College is a public school. It's part of the CUNY system, which is the city's public university system, whereas Fordham is an extremely expensive private school. So I guess it's natural that this somewhat exclusive private school would feel more closed off, but man, the difference was striking. Also, I'm about to talk about bigotry on campus, so I did want to note that I do not think that the bad vibes I got from my most recent visit to Fordham had anything to do with homophobia or people thinking I didn't belong there. Like, I do want to be totally fair. I had a backpack on, it was really cold, and I was wearing a huge coat, so no one could see my tattoos. And there wasn't really anything to distinguish me from the students around me. And usually, unless I'm wearing a tank top or leggings, strangers just assume I'm a dude most of the time, especially if I'm not talking to anyone. So I definitely don't think people thought I was a queer person and had an issue with that and were being weird. I think people just assumed I was a male student. And I mention this because even if you seem like you belong, there's just something uneasy and isolating and paranoia-inducing about being there, in my opinion. All right, so all of this brings us into the racism, homophobia, and just general bigotry that, at least when I was a student, tended to crop up on campus. So let's start way back. I believe I mentioned this earlier in the series, but reminder that the original Fordham Jesuits from Kentucky were enslavers. I wanted to read a little bit from the book Fordham, A History of the Jesuit University of New York, 1841 to 2003. In the years prior to the outbreak of hostilities in 1861, there may have been less antagonism than one might expect between the Southern and the Northern students at St. John's College, because most of the New York Irish shared the anti-abolitionist sentiments of their Southern brethren. So, not a promising start. Then the book goes on to say, as former slave owners in Kentucky, the Jesuits at Rose Hill might also have been expected to be ardent anti-abolitionists, but such conjecture may be inaccurate. When Father Maréchal, a French-born veteran of the Kentucky Mission, cast his ballot for President of the United States in 1860 at the voting booth in West Farms, he announced publicly that he had voted for the abolitionist candidate. An unhappy fellow voter threatened him with physical harm, but the feisty Maréchal raised his cane and challenged him to a fight. His critic turned tail and ran away. I've talked about this in past episodes, but New York City was historically a pretty pro-slavery place, which is something that is often swept under the rug because people just look at the Civil War and they're like, oh, well, New York was in the Union, so everyone always hated slavery there. And that's really not true. Even after slavery was abolished in New York City at the very late date of 1827, business interests in New York City made a lot of money from the labor of enslaved people in the South. So I'm not trying to say that anyone at Fordham was necessarily more anti-abolitionist or pro-slavery than their peers in New York City, but I also want to make the point that Fordham, like many similar institutions, began with people who had pro-slavery sentiment and who thought it was okay to own humans, you know? So let's swing back to the present day. I mentioned that there was a lot of bigotry on campus when I was a student, and I dug up some articles and data points elaborating on that, mostly from after I graduated. I really hope that things are better now than they were then, but I don't really know how students feel on campus nowadays. And as usual, I try to load information about racism and homophobia into the end of episodes when I can, so that if that's something that's difficult for you to listen to, you can turn this off now without missing any other topics. But with that being said, let's look at some of these incidents. So I found an article in the Daily News, which is, that's not a Fordham newspaper, it's like a major newspaper, from March 5th, 2012, talking about a Fordham student who came home to her dorm room the previous month, so February 2012, to find the N-word written on her door in permanent marker. And to read from the article, the slur was sanded over, but the door was not repainted until 9 days later, an example of the university's weak response to bias incidents. And the student who was the victim of this crime said, the university thinks this is an isolated incident, when in reality, students of color feel isolated every day. So to read more from the article, in fact, on Friday, the N-word was again found on campus, this time scratched into a patch covering a hole in the wall of a men's bathroom. Students list several other disturbing incidents this school year, including a student scrolling around campus in blackface on Halloween and a different racial epithet etched twice on a sidewalk. The article goes on to quote another student talking about the slur written on the door, who says that it, quote, really speaks to a larger culture of silence on this campus. He said that students alerted administration last year about slurs targeting a lesbian student to no avail. Okay, then I found an article in The Observer, which is Fordham's Lincoln Center newspaper, and it talks about how 3 roommates at Rose Hill, the Bronx campus, They went to football practice on a Saturday morning, and then the two white roommates got back to their room and they didn't see anything on their door. And then an hour later, the third roommate, who was black, returned to the room and found the N-word carved into their door. And the article cites a CBS article that said, from February to March 2012, there were 3 suspected bias incidents. And there's a quote from the president of the Black Student Alliance who says, "This is a larger issue. This is not an isolated incident. It's not just one thing. It's not just a joke. This is something that needs to be addressed systemically within the Fordham community." The article also talks a lot about how the administration was calling it a bias incident instead of something like a hate crime. And it talked about how students were protesting about the nomenclature since it sort of feels like the severity of the incident was being downplayed. I found another article from September 2015 in the Fordham Ram, so the Bronx campus's newspaper. That article mentions another instance of bigotry that also happened that month. To read from that, the second incident occurred on Sunday, September 20th, when, according to public safety, a student notified university officials that he saw, quote, a crude backwards swastika approximately 2 inches across, scratched into a stairwell in the residence hall. Oh, and if you're wondering what residence hall it was Martyrs. So then I found a message from the university president from December 2015, which read, "I learned this morning that once again, Fordham students report that they were targets of racial and sexual slurs from a fellow student at their off-campus housing late last night. There was a 2016 incident involving homophobic language being written on someone's door in Finley Hall, which I mentioned in the Demon in the Basement episode. There was also a study done in 2013 to assess how safe queer students felt on campus, which I think is worth pausing and taking a look at here. So I just wanted to read some snippets of the report's executive summary to kind of give you an overview of the vibe. Students' outness at Fordham indicates a prevalence of fear and discomfort, and that these feelings vary depending on who a student is interacting with. We also find that students are frequently without any family support and can come from hostile high school environments. A large portion of students report feeling unsafe, uncomfortable, or unwelcome in residence halls, and these concerns impact housing decisions. The vast majority of student athletes experience discrimination or harassment. Students are likely to frequently experience ambient hostility in homophobic language and jokes. Verbal harassment and even threats of physical violence are not uncommon, but they are rarely reported to authorities and seldom discussed. This leaves the issue largely hidden, provides no recourse, and leaves the affected students without support. Compelling evidence of physical violence based on sexual or gender identity is presented. Many students indicate that the offices and individuals they have reported incidents to were not at all responsive and respectful to their needs as a sexual or gender minority. Further, fears that the university will not take their report seriously, or that their report will be ineffective if they do, are major factors preventing students from reporting. Students who experience harassment and discrimination based on their sexual or gender identity report that they seriously consider transferring. Their academic work suffers, they regret coming out at Fordham, and an alarming number of students struggle with internalized homophobia, blaming themselves for the treatment of others or believing their negative remarks. So this report is a little old, right? It's from 2013, so it's almost a decade old. I'm not aware of a newer report. Maybe there is one, and I wasn't finding one. But I thought it was valuable to have that information when looking at this larger place and wondering why something might be off with it, right? I talk a lot about my personal experience in the episode that I've mentioned several times now in this episode, The Demon in the Basement, and I talk about how the ambient homophobia at Fordham had a major negative impact on my own mental health, and in that episode, I do ask some questions about whether that had any impact on my paranormal experiences on campus. And to me, the answer is yes. Like, that put me in such a bad headspace so consistently that it's hard to believe that it didn't have some impact on every experience I had on campus, paranormal or not. And again, if we are perhaps going by this theory that some paranormal phenomena or entities might feed off of negative emotions, we're looking at a place with, like, historically at least, I can't speak to what the campus is like now, a lot of homophobia, a lot of racism, a lot of paranoia and feeling of needing to shut out the outside world. And that's huge, I think. And, if I had to give one reason why I think the place is haunted, it's because of being stuck in the past, because of some of this negativity that's being generated, but also just because it's hard to attend an institution, at least at the time that I was there, where everything felt so backwards looking, right? Like so concerned with the past. And, like if you're looking at just the past all the time, of course you're going to find some ghosts, right? And of course that will affect how you interact with the world at large. Before we leave this subject, I wanted to talk about the last time I went to Fordham's campus, not the time a couple weeks ago, but the last time before that. Like I mentioned, I hadn't stepped foot on Fordham's campus in 7 years, despite living, like an hour to an hour and a half long subway ride away, and despite being a frequent visitor to the botanical gardens, which are across the street from Fordham. And there is a reason for that. In 2015, shortly after I started dating my then girlfriend, now wife, we went up to the botanical gardens and I suggested that we walk through Fordham first because I was excited to show her the campus. Again, I really can be naive, I guess. This was a random Saturday, maybe Sunday morning in the spring, and we walked around and we might have been holding hands a little bit. It was clear we were a couple, and we got some very dirty looks from students and from people who were staring at us, and that made my wife uncomfortable, reasonably so. So we had to stop holding hands. And so already I was like, this is not going well. Then, as we were passing by Martyrs Court, the dorm, we looked up at a window, and hanging in the window, prominently displayed for anyone passing by to see, was a Confederate flag. It was a large flag. It filled up a lot of the window. I have no idea how long the flag had been up or whether the student had been asked to take it down before or later. But on a weekend morning in, it's like April or May 2015, in the Bronx, in New York City, a Confederate flag was being flown by a student on Fordham's campus. I grew up in the Bible Belt, like I mentioned. I almost never saw the Confederate flag in my Texas hometown, yet some racist felt emboldened to fly it on Fordham's campus. That sort of action does not happen in a vacuum, and a student wouldn't do that if they felt it would not be tolerated, and perhaps even celebrated by at least some people on campus. So I know I've said this a bunch of times throughout the series, but obviously there were a ton of great people at Fordham. Obviously, not everyone at Fordham was racist and homophobic, and I never had any problem with the professors. The professors who I had were all amazing and tended to be much more progressive than the students, at least in my experience there. I wouldn't say that even the majority of people on campus were racist or homophobic, right? Like, I think I've said this before, but it just doesn't take that many bigoted students and administrators to make everyone else feel uncomfortable, unsafe, surveilled, trapped. And I will say I had some negative experiences with administrators at Fordham. So while the professors were all amazing, I cannot say the same thing about some of the administrators on Fordham's campus. People involved in student life, etc. And like I said, I just think this sort of energy in a place could certainly contribute to experiences of the uncanny there. So anyway, you might ask, Chris, if you hated your time at Fordham so much, why did you decide to do a 12-part series on the subject? And I think that would be a fair question to ask. Here's the answer that I have. First, I don't think that anyone can deny that the university has a higher than average number of hauntings, urban legends, and tales of weirdness, both for New York City in general and for universities in general. So to me, that makes it a good topic just on an objective basis. Second, it's the site of some of my earliest paranormal experiences, so of course there's a personal connection there. And of course, I've already done a bunch of research over the years trying to make sense of my experiences there. And also just out of interest in the history of a place where I lived for a formative period in my life, right? So I'd already been thinking about it for years, etc. If I were trying to psychoanalyze myself, maybe I would say that in this series, I've been trying to look at a place where I was very deeply miserable and unhappy and trying to put a mostly positive spin on it. I may even be trying to enamel it with this layer of the paranormal. So, for example, when I think of Finley Hall nowadays, I think of urban legends and my paranormal experiences there, not other worse memories. And that goes for the whole campus. I don't know, maybe that's what I'm doing, maybe not. It definitely wasn't my intention when setting out on this series, but that could possibly be something at work here. Though also, I'm not neurotypical. I love a deep dive, and I have a tendency to keep diving until I can find no more information, and that's when I stop diving. So I just kept finding more and more stuff, so I just kept going. I don't know. It's probably a little of all of the above, but I feel better the less I think about my motives for this series, so I'll just stop the self-reflection here. And I think I've kind of already said what my conclusion is here about the Fordham hauntings, but in case it wasn't clear, let me just say, in conclusion, why do I think Fordham is haunted? A bunch of reasons. I don't think it's any one of the reasons I've talked about in the last 3 episodes. I think it's a combination of many of them, and probably also some factors that I have not thought about. And I'm very interested if anyone has any additional theories behind some of these hauntings, theories about why this place might be uniquely haunted, etc. Love to hear them. And I just wanted to say again, thank you for listening to this series. I really appreciate it. Whether you listened to just this episode, just a couple episodes in the series, or the whole series, I'm really grateful that you decided to listen to me deep dive into the history and hauntings of a small university that isn't super well known outside of this region of the United States. It's a kind of random topic, and 12 episodes is a lot of episodes to do on anything, but especially perhaps something this obscure. And, if I find more information, I will do a follow-up episode or episodes. If you're listening to this and you went to Fordham and you had some weird experiences, please email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com, because I still want to hear your strange stories. Even if you're listening to this quite a long time after it was first published, I still want to know what weird stories people have at Fordham that I haven't heard yet. So if you or a friend have some stories to tell me, please email me. And that's it. That's all I've got to say about Fordham for now. Only 12-ish hours worth of stuff. Anyway, if you're wondering what I'm going to talk about next, I'm working on a short series, let's say, about some hauntings in Texas, in an area very close to my hometown. I've got probably about 3 episodes worth of stuff about the old Alton Bridge, which is a very famous bridge near Denton, Texas. It's also known as the Goatman's Bridge. You would have seen it on BuzzFeed Unsolved and I think Ghost Adventures, one of the big ghost hunting shows. I've watched the BuzzFeed Unsolved episode. I haven't gotten to the Ghost Adventures one yet, but it's been featured on some major paranormal TV shows. It's pretty well known. I visited it back in December for the first time, even though I grew up embarrassingly close to it and didn't know it existed until a couple years ago. So I'm excited to talk about that. And it's probably going to turn into a series about some of the other creepy stuff in Denton, Texas, because that is an area with a ton of hauntings. You know, it's a place where there's like ghost tours and that sort of thing. And I don't think I've done any episodes about Texas yet. So yeah, that's what you can look forward to next. I've also got some other stuff on the back burner, episodes I've been working on. I want to do an episode relatively soon about how I've been doing the solo Estes method, which is, a method of investigation. I talked about it in my Ghosts of Mount Beacon episode, but I wanted to have an episode dedicated to it with kind of like a how-to for anyone who wants to do that. So I've been working on that. And I've also been working a bit on maybe just one episode about some places that I really like to hike in North Carolina that are very creepy and have an interesting history and have hidden cemeteries, and where I've done some Estes sessions, some solo Estes sessions. There's this really cool hidden cemetery in one of them where I was about to do a solo Estes session and then something really, really weird happened. And then the session itself was pretty interesting too. I'm excited to tell those stories as well. So, a lot of stuff coming up. I've really, really enjoyed this Fordham series, but I'm also really excited to talk about some other stuff. So, next episode, you can look forward to the Old Alton Bridge. In the meantime, you can follow me on Instagram at buriedsecretspodcast. You can email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com if you have any other theories about Fordham hauntings, if you have any Fordham stories of creepy things, or, if you just want to say hello. You can check out the show notes at buriedsecretspodcast.com. And if you liked this episode, please rate and review, please tell your friends about it. And thanks so much for listening.